Let's jump into lesson one, and we're talking about a vision for faithful church stewardship. And so, what we really want to do is within this, we want to unpack the different types of church governance models, a biblical vision for a finance team and a finance team that serves within that church governance model, and then the practical responsibilities of that team, and even a real practical of a finance team charter. So faithful stewardship. That's We're talking about a vision for faithful church stewardship, and just to give a definition of that, to get our minds thinking about that. Merriam-Webster defines stewardship as the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. Oxford Dictionary defines stewardship as the job of supervising or taking care of something. Very basic definitions, but think about steward versus an owner. Both of those definitions are fitting for what we're talking about. One thing I love about my story and background is my dad actually is a minister. He pastored a local church for about 10 years, and after that time, he felt called for a season to start a ministry called Concepts in Stewardship, very relevant to this lesson we're talking about. And for several years, he would travel around the country doing seminars in churches on biblical stewardship, and I got to travel a bit with him during those years. And as I was prepping for this course, I actually looked back at a book he wrote on stewardship, and in one of the chapters, he referenced Psalm 24:1, which says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein." It's a simple verse, part of a really beautiful psalm, but it's just a reminder that it is God's, that God is the owner, we are the stewards. And then in the book, my dad wrote, "If God is in the position of ownership, then we are stewards. Our job is to manage his resources. After all, by definition, a steward manages the resources and the estate of another individual. He uses the assets in ways in which benefit the owner. Since God has declared it's all his, my function is to manage the resources he guides into my life. By contrast, the philosophy of this world states, I am the owner. As a Christian, I should recognize that statement as an error." I love the part of that quote from the book that says, as a steward, that a steward uses the assets in ways which benefits the owner. We touched on this, but what is the primary job of the owner of a for-profit business? To maximize shareholder value. But in church and not-profit world, churches are part of nonprofit accounting. The Christian mindset would say, I am a steward of the resources. I'm a steward of the assets of this organization. And so therefore, I need to utilize those assets for the purposes that this organization exists. Again, we don't utilize these tax-exempt donations to give out massive bonuses to the pastors at the end of the year. You can do bonuses. We're going to talk about compensation and fringe benefits, all that. I think it's Unit 3, Lesson 6. We'll get into that. But we exist to steward the vision and the mission that God has given for the church, and to further that exempt purpose. There's actually legally binding things around that within the United States. And so beyond that, back to the spiritual side of this, first and foremost, we just at the outset, can we position ourselves to see God as owner and we're stewards, not only in our personal lives as believers, but in the organizations that he's entrusted to us that we lead and serve in. And I don't want to get too preachy here, but I think this is the unit to really talk about this, that the heart of the gospel is that Christ had the fullness of riches for all of eternity. But what did he do for us? On our behalf, he became poor, that he came to earth. He took on flesh. He died on the cross, died the death that you and I deserve, so that we can have the fullness of riches in Christ for all eternity. That's the heart and message of the gospel. And sometimes those riches will be financial blessing, and sometimes those riches come and so many other blessings in our lives. But we keep that gospel perspective in mind, and when the Holy Spirit opens our eyes to see that truth, we can hold that right posture of seeing ourselves of stewards of what God has entrusted to us, and seek to do this work with diligence. So those who are called to ultimately lead out and stewarding the vision and resources given to the church to support that vision will depend on your church governance structure. And then the finance team is going to come alongside to work within that church governance structure. So we're going to jump into some of the practicals of that. Before we do, anything you'd like to tag on? I'll hit the red button. I'm done with my long spiel.
No, it was really good. And I think, a lot of people that work in church finance that are drawn to those finance teams are maybe, not to typecast all of us, but maybe more type A, detail-oriented, administratively gifted people. And I think sometimes and I'll put myself, I won't put all you in there, but we can want to jump to the practicals even in this course, like, hey, tell me how to do budgets, or tell me how to do compensation, or tell me what your giving system is. And I think it's really important to frame what we're talking about in the biblical story in this beautiful passage of Psalm 24, that, hey, what you're doing is not just transactional, it's not just practical or pragmatic. It is incredibly sacred work. Stewarding God's resources for his church, or for an organization that's supporting the church in some way, is a beautiful work. And like Chris said, it's not something that you get financial reward for, and often you put many hours into it. But it is an incredibly important work, and I think it's in this first unit, maybe the biggest takeaway, hopefully by the end of it, is that you come away with a why you do what you do. Why do I serve on the finance team? Why do I count that offering? Why do I go to these meetings? Why do I have these wrestles with budget? And ultimately, it's because we're wanting to steward what God has given us well, wise and faithful. So I think that's a really good word, and I'm really excited to jump into this first lesson.
So this first lesson is working within your church governance model. What does governance mean? It may be self-explanatory, but not to assume. Governance is those who govern and have authority within the organization to make decisions. So when we talk about church governance, real simply, who's in charge? Who does the buck stop with? And there can be nuance and variations, but to think of it really simply, there's primarily 3 church governance structures that will help frame the discussion of what a finance team serves under. Is your church elder-led? Is it staff-led? Or is it congregation-led? So we're going to walk through each of those 3 primary church governance models, and then how a finance team can work within that. And again, I won't give these caveats all the time, but if you're a Christian school or you're a Christian nonprofit, just think about, how am I setting up my board? How am I setting up my leadership team? And then how does my finance and administrative function support us as we have governance over that? So first, church governance model is elder-led, which naturally would mean that the elders have governance of the church. They have final decision-making authority. We are part of an elder-led church. That's the church governance model that our church operates within. Often within this structure, there are paid elders and there are lay elders within an elder team. Usually you also would have deacons within this that support the work of ministry, that support the work that the elders are doing. And so when we're talking about church governance models, I'm specifically relating this to the finance function and how finance teams interact here. I'm not making value statements on church governance as a whole. I'm relating it specifically to finance team in this course. And as it relates to financial governance, elder-led churches have this position of really a more centralized authority structure than what you see in a congregational model. And even sometimes if you have a larger staff, then you would see in a staff-led governance structure while still having accountability in place through shared leadership. Typically, the idea of a elder-led church is shared leadership. It doesn't come down to one leader. You have a term we would use is a plurality of leadership, so that you have accountability and that you have transparency within that leadership group. Typically, in an elder-led church, you have extensive qualifications that have to be met. There's scriptural qualifications of an elder, and then different denominations and church structures have things that they also look for. We would talk in terms of calling, competency, character, those type of things. Also very important, along with the biblical qualifications of an elder and how Scripture guides us in that. But within an elder-led church governance model, it should be easier to avoid mission drift, vision drift. That's what we're talking about when we get into budgeting, when we're talking about the function of the finance team, trying to keep aligned with your purpose and why you exist. An elder-led church should be able to do that well if they're functioning properly, because you have less voices than a congregational model, and you have accountability because you're going to have paid pastors and you might have a lay elder who also meets these qualifications, but this isn't their full-time job. So you have a nice balance of how that can work together. Typically, as I mentioned, this is going to be a top-down decision-making structure. So when we get into budgeting, you can think about in an elder-led church, the elders are going to say, okay, staff team, operation team, you have X amount this year. We feel like we can spend to create your budget. And the elders are going to let everyone know what the parameters are and what important financial decisions need to be made. We think that if that's done in a healthy way, that's in conjunction with your finance team. One thing we have put in place at Redeemer, at our church, where we serve as elders, is a finance team review of the budget and elder approval. We're going to get into this more in the budgeting section. We also present the budget annually to the congregation, as well as giving monthly updates about the budget in our newsletter and a financial update in each quarterly partner meeting. So when you have this more centralized with one group within the church, having final decision-making authority again, specific to finances, you want to make sure that you have transparency, that you have good communication, that you're letting everyone know of the decisions that you're making. One criticism that can come to any centralized decision-making group, like especially if you have a small elder team or a board and elder-led church, is you have to fight what I'm talking about. You have to fight perception of a lack of communication or transparency. So if you're in that spot, if you're in an elder-led church, just think through safeguards and communications so that you can make sure you're disseminating the right information to, in a business term, stakeholders, the congregation, the staff, the ministry leaders. I think that's really important when you're thinking about that church governance model. Anything you would add about elder-led churches?
Yeah, I think, as you said, full disclosure, we are part of an elder-led church. I planted an elder-led church, and so there is an interesting dynamic sometimes when the finance team is trying to give, they have expertise usually in stewardship issues, hopefully. And the elders have a certain vision they want to have. And so ultimately, who's going to make the call? And ultimately the elders are, but I would say this to the elders, if you're in that position or if you're a pastor, is that if you're going to put a finance team in place and ask for their input, take it seriously. Mm-hmm. Like, let there be cordial and God-honoring pushback between the two so that good stewardship happens. I would also say, probably on your elder team, you need a couple of qualified biblical elders that are financially gifted. Like at Redeemer, most of our time, we have an elder leading our finance team. So there is like a liaison on the finance team who's a part of the elder board and a part of the finance team. And so that relationship can be tricky at times, but I think if there's good communication and the elders really respect and honor the gifts and the questions and the pushback, even welcome elders, the pushback of the finance team, because it's really their job to make sure you're stewarding it. So if you're going to do this new initiative, you need to be pushed to the extent that you can make a really good case for it and have the finance team have some sort of agreement there, and even compromise at times. That's probably most relevant around budget season, but there probably will come up other things throughout the year that you're going to have to operate within this unique governance of, hey, how do we honor our finance team while at the same time the elders are really the ones entrusted to lead the church. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's good. In our context, we'll just quickly say, we have Kevin Adderholt's part of our finance team. We have other really respected individuals in good standing, and their advice and their counsel, we do take it seriously. Like you said, that's important. We're so grateful for the finance team that we have. So again, think through that. If you're an elder led church, that's such an important thing that we would recommend. Second church governance model is staff-led church. So within a staff-led church, pastoral and ministry staff have the final decision-making authority, and this is the most centralized governance structure. So especially in a small staff-led church, you might have one person making all the decisions. You might have two people that have the final decision-making authority. It can obviously go out from there to larger church staffs. The pros of this is the most agile, and you can get things done more quickly. Even in an elder team, if you're working around lay elders' work schedules, you can't just hop in an office or get on a phone call all the time because you're working around their work schedule. If you have a small staff-led team, you can get things done quickly, and you should certainly stay aligned with the vision and mission, because the church is led by the people who are responsible for creating that vision and executing that vision. So that really should be operating in a healthy way, doing that well. You have to be careful within this structure to bring in outside voices, to bring in accountability for many of the reasons we just discussed, particularly around compensation. You never want to be in a staff-led church where only the staff is reviewing and setting their compensation. That's obvious why you wouldn't want to do that, I would assume, just for transparency and accountability. Staff-led churches can more easily fall into these dynamics where one voice is really the one making decisions, and that's not always the most healthy dynamic either. And same with elder-led churches. We would recommend in a staff-led church that you have a finance team with visibility to financials, again, helping set compensation and be involved in regular meetings for accountability and transparency. Anything to add on staff-led churches?
Along those lines, I would just say it'd be wise for if you are in a staff-led and you're the senior pastor, and you recognize that you have a lot of sway in that direction, for the sake of integrity and for the sake of not having a conflict of interest, you really do need to value the voice of your finance team. I would work if you're going to serve on a finance team in a church like this, I would make sure that there are certain conversations, like you said, when we're setting compensation. It's hard to set the lead pastor or senior pastor's salary when he's sitting across from you, And so where there are some conversations that you as the senior pastor say, hey, I'm delegating, I'm entrusting this to you for the sake of integrity and visibility. I'm going to have you guys do that. And what you come back with, I'm going to honor. So there really is a burden back on the staff to kind of share some of that decision-making, especially financially, with the team. And I would say the smaller it gets, the more important it becomes to have that team that can really kind of be a balance to what's going on. So no other comments, but yeah, I think what you said is really good there.
The third primary church governance structure is congregational. Let's see if I can get this book here. So this book, let's see if you can see that there. It's Budgeting for a Healthy Church by Jamie Dunlop. And Kevin, who I've mentioned several times, has actually, I think he's met Jamie in person. Jamie's been kind enough to agree to come on a podcast with us in the future. I have a ton of respect for Jamie. We use that book as our guide for a lot of the budgeting work that we do. I could not recommend it highly enough, and we'll reference that a lot when we get into our budgeting section. I mention it now because Jamie is part of a congregational led church, and so even though we're an elder led church, we've been able to pull a lot of good wisdom from Jamie and from this book. He has a ton of great stuff on budgeting, but within a congregational model church, the congregation has final decision making authority for the church. And it's this idea of this priesthood of believers, and so the power rests amongst the congregation. And so whatever the congregation, it's typically done via vote, usually a majority vote, and whatever the congregation votes for is what happens. In the finance realm, whatever gets the majority vote, or whatever kind of vote that it needs, that's the budget for the year. That's the financial decision that gets made. So in this structure, in the congregational model of church, what's happening is the congregation is making the decisions. The congregation is setting the tone for what happens financially and in other important decisions. And then the staff and church leadership is fulfilling the directives of whatever the congregation votes for. So that's, elder-led's over here, congregational's over here, staff's kind of in the middle in terms of, you think about the roles of staff fulfilling that. On the congregational model, you really, they're going to vote for who's pastor a lot of times in a congregational model, even to that level. And so an advantage of a congregational model is a high level of accountability and transparency. I mean, there could not be a higher level of accountability and transparency, because the whole body of believers is coming together, looking at the information and making decisions. And there should be, if this is run well, a fair process by which to make those decisions. Now, a challenge within that is, and we're going to get into this in another one of our lessons, is fund allocation and nonprofit accounting that churches fall under. You're talking about designation of funds, and so you'll have a general operating budget, general operating funds, and then you can also designate to certain things. And so in elder and staff-led churches that I've worked with, had experience working with, typically you have a lot less funds. You might have a building fund, missions fund, along those lines. Where I've seen a lot more funds typically is within congregational model, because what's happening, the decision-making power resides within the congregation. So you can get situations where factions of that want to get their thing done. And so now they're going to create separate bank accounts, separate funds. I've seen aerobics funds, lawnmower funds, new kitchen stove funds, all of those things that in other models of church would just fall under your general operating. What they're saying is, no, I've got to allocate for this now, because if I don't, this could get outvoted. So I'm getting it on the books that we're going to spend money for this lawnmower. So you have a lot more of those kind of designations, so that what the congregation says is going to happen with that money is what's going to happen. So those are just things to recognize and to think about, and then you get situations where it's like, okay, we've got $10,000 in our lawnmower fund, but we can't pay payroll. Now what happens? And so we'll talk about the difference between legal restrictions of designations of giving and just internal designations, but you're essentially earmarking things when you're setting up these funds, and that can happen again more in a congregational type model. And so those are just things to take into account. I'm not hating on the congregational model at all. Again, I have tremendous respect for Capitol Hill Baptist and Jamie, where he's executive pastor, and the book that he's written. You just have to know these things, especially if you're starting out and trying to decide, where do I go? What type of church governance do I want to set up? Just know the pros and cons. If you're on a church finance team, understand what kind of church governance model do we have? Therefore, how can we best support that? And even in terms of, do we just have church finance team members that serve indefinitely until they're tired and say, I'm done? Or do we need to have fresh eyes looking at things where they serve a 1 to 2 year term? So those are all things you've got to keep in mind with that. Anything you would add related to congregational model?
Not really. That's helpful. I mean, I think all of these models, like Chris said, it's important to understand the context that your finance team is operating in, because, you might have a personal conviction that isn't exactly lining up with maybe the church you're at, but you need to honor and work within the governance and decision-making processes of your particular church. And so I think it's important for a finance team to understand the unique challenges of your model, the unique benefits, and then to seek to operate with clarity in that model as best they can. So, yeah.
Yeah. You can see any of these models abused. You can see any of these models done beautifully and done well. And that's part of just the beauty of being part of the body of Christ is we may disagree on which church governance model we think is best, but we can still serve and work together across a variety of different types of churches. And these principles will apply across all three. The final three things that I want to say related to church governance before we move on. One, you need to have bylaws that clearly spells out who has governance authority within your church. You can't just say we're an elder-led church. You need to have bylaws that support that. Within the United States, you have to have a EIN, employee identification number, to operate as a church. In the state of Texas, you have to actually, there's an application process you have to go through. There's paperwork you have to fill out in the state of Texas. In other states, same thing. We would recommend that you fill out your exempt paperwork. There's legal things that you have to do to say, we are going to operate as a church. Questions you have to answer as part of that nonprofit paperwork. And so part of that, if you do go through that Form 1023 application to have the IRS put their stamp of approval on you as a nonprofit, you don't have to, but we recommend it. If you go through that, they're going to want to look at your bylaws. Even if you don't go through that, we say have bylaws in place so that you have that compliance and legal covering, that how you're operating as a church has been thought out beforehand, and that's your constitution, so to speak. How the the United States has its governing documents. The church needs to have governing documents that are bylaws. You can get an attorney to help you. You can get Church Biz to help you. There's plenty of companies out there that will help you put together bylaws if you don't know how to do that. But make sure you have that done well, have it done from the get-go, that outlines who has governing authority, who's going to make the decisions, who can allocate funds, financial, and there's many other things outside of financial that need to be contained within these bylaws.
So would you say one bit of homework for everyone, every finance team leader or person taking this, is to, one, understand the church governance that you're a part of, so understanding your church's model, and then acknowledging that our church should have bylaws. If you don't, that's probably project A.
Yeah.
We might need a different course on that. But I would familiarize myself, if I'm going to serve on a finance team, with those bylaws, because, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the compliance that the government is going to ask of churches is to ask you to act according to how you set out in your bylaws.
Correct.
So as a finance team, you need to understand your bylaws so that you can understand how to appropriately act and stay in compliance.
Absolutely. That's a great practical application for that. I would recommend exactly what Josh said, to take that first step to understand the bylaws of your church if you haven't yet done that. That's a great point. Second thing I would say, and as it relates to church governance models, is finance team needs to work well and support the governance structure of your church. We've talked about that. I'm not going to talk any more about that. Third point is, this is just more of kind of Chris's encouragement. I feel passionate about this. Whatever governance model you have, if you're a leader or the leader, lead out in how God is calling you to lead out. Feel a boldness to do that. Feel a confidence to do that. Know that calling is from God, and He will sustain you. Even if you don't feel confident in this area, let us help you. Let us support you. Specific to this course is the task of financial decision making. Too often I hear when we're asking a question of a pastor, an executive pastor, well, I don't know what to do. That's what we hired you guys for. You tell me. And I'm saying, well, no, we're not here to make financial decisions for your church. We're here to help you make financial decisions for your church. We're not an employee. We're not staff. We're not in your board. We don't have governance authority. Let us help you operate within the authority that God has given you, or someone taking this course who's supporting those with governance authority. And so in small churches, I just talked with a pastor, said, hey, I know you're feeling overwhelmed right now. Is there one member, a layperson that could help you start a finance team? What's that next practical step? If this is an area of weakness for you, financial decision making, and you have governance, what's the next practical step you can take to better yourself? You don't have to be perfect at it, but you do have responsibility of governance, of which finances is a part of that. Again, in that book, Budgeting for a Healthy Church by Jamie Dunlop, one of his quotes I love early in the book when he's just talking about the vision for why we do what we do, why finance and budgeting is important. He says, pastors cannot delegate all responsibility for the budget to others as if finances are somehow separate from the ministry of the church. And that's so spot on. It's the finances actually show what you value. It's really kind of a signpost of those things. And so that's my charge to those in governance or you supporting those. Help them, come alongside them so they can make the right decisions.
Yeah, that's good.
So with that, that's kind of the end of church governance portion, and we're going to move into talking practicals of the biblical purpose of a finance team.